Hey everybody, welcome to another Friday Prophets. We are looking at Isaiah 43 to 45 today. And even though it's only 3 chapters, you may have noticed it's quite a long reading. There's a lot to be covered here. And this section is covering 3 different things. The first thing is just, again, continuing the Lord's promise of deliverance out of exile, that God is a God who's no longer going to punish, but he's going to restore the people. They're going to return back to the land, and they're going to prosper and live in security, and they're going to be God's people once more. And so that's mainly chapter 43. The second section, mainly in chapter 44, but also in chapter 45, is God's warning to his people to stay away from idolatry. He talks about how silly it is that someone will go out into the woods and they'll chop down a tree and they'll use, and they do that so they can get firewood from themselves. But out of the leftovers, they say, you know what, I'm going to form and fashion and carve an idol for myself. I'm going to bow down and worship this thing. He's like, don't you see, like the same thing that you use for these sort of mundane purposes, like cooking, using, wood to cook a fire, you're worshiping an idol, a false god based on that. Don't you see how silly that is? So there's a really strong warning for his people to stay away from idols, how they don't fulfill, and they don't deliver what they promise because they're empty, they're hollow, they're just nothing. They're not even real. And so stay away. And it's a warning for us to be reminded of the things that we often run after that maybe in 21st century Australia, we don't go out and craft images for ourselves out of stone or rocks or whatever, or wood, but we do sort of have idols. They're just a bit more subtle. We still run after the thing that an idol represents, right? We go after money, or we go after power, or we go after celebrity, or we go after whatever it could be, a job promotion, or having that person in our life, and these are the things that we obsess about, and we worry about them, and we sort of strain every thought toward going after these things. And so God says, don't be those people. You once were those people, and this is what got you in trouble in the first place, that you trusted in things that aren't even real rather than the living God. So don't run after them. And the third section is about how God is going to send his anointed one. The word for that is the Hebrew word Messiah. Now, this is a bit different because the anointed one who's listed here is someone named Cyrus. It's not someone that we later call Jesus, who we say is God's Messiah, his anointed one. And so I thought it'd just be worth just a minute sort of rewinding in history and asking ourselves, what is this all about, and what's going on here, and who is Cyrus, and why is he called an anointed one or a Messiah? So, you may remember that, again, there was once a kingdom of Israel ruled by Saul, David, Solomon. After Solomon's death, a civil war ensued, and they split into 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south. And both kingdoms lived side by side, and eventually both kingdoms turned away from Yahweh as Lord and relied on other gods, and basically because of that they became corrupt and unjust and wicked. And so God sent prophets like Isaiah to warn them, to say turn back, but neither of them listened. Israel was by far worse than Judah, at least at first, and Israel had prophets sent to them. They didn't listen, and eventually they were conquered by a kingdom to the north of them called the Assyrians in 722 BC. Then the southern kingdom of Judah was the only one left, and prophets again came there because even though Judah sort of fared better than Israel when it came to worshiping God, they still failed the test. And eventually they, in 586, 587 BC, were conquered by their neighbors to the east, the Babylonians. And they were ransacked, and the people who were left were sent into exile. And there they remain in exile for about 50, 60, 70 years. So here's a little diagram that sort of outlines all of this. So while the God's people were under the Babylonians, they're under a guy named Nebuchadnezzar for the most part. This is where we see the book of Daniel being written. But at some stage, the Babylonians themselves were conquered by a kingdom to their east called the Persians. And the Persians became the de facto kingdom, sort of empire of the area. And so Jews were then subject to them. This is what the book of Esther is all about. But a guy named Cyrus became king of the Persians. And this guy had a favorable disposition to the Jewish people. And what we see here in the text in Isaiah 45 is actually, this is God's doing. That this guy didn't know about Yahweh. He didn't know about God, but God grabbed a hold of his heart and used him for his purposes. God raised him up as a Messiah, someone who is anointed, who's been given sort of special spirit by God to do God's purposes. So Cyrus is the first person ever mentioned in Isaiah to be used as a Messiah-like figure. And what we know is that Cyrus was the first person to allow the Jewish people to return back to the land of Israel, to rebuild their city, to rebuild the temple. And this is what ends the period of exile. And so he, during his lifetime, was very kind to the Jewish people. And even though he was not a believer and didn't know God, God used him for his purposes. And so this is the first time we sort of see this word used. Later on, Isaiah picks up this same terminology. Several people in the Old Testament are actually called anointed ones or messiahs. But in a couple chapters, we'll see that he's still not done in his work. Even when the people return, there's still more that needs to be done. Their sin needs to be dealt with once and for all. So God was going to raise up a permanent Messiah, the final picture of the Messiah, the ultimate one, who is going to come and deal with our sin and brokenness and restore us into God's family once and for all. So we'll get into that in a few weeks' time. But that is that's our study for today. See you later. Bye.